Okay, this is your last sample for seams that we're going to do, and this is called a welt seam. What we're going to do is you're going to take those two pieces of 3.5 by 6, and you're going to do, place right sides together, just like we typically do in most of our samples. And what we're going to do is we're going to then line up the edge of our fabric at 5/8 inch seam allowance, just like this is our standard, the standard seam allowance that you'll always stitch on unless otherwise stated. So when in doubt, always use a 5/8. Since our last sample, and I almost did this, since our last sample was kind of that heartbeat, using some of the kind of decorative zigzags, I need to use my, turn my selector counterclockwise or to the left and reposition it so I have my straight stitch, or my dotted line stitch, and that my needle is lined up center. And then I'm going to readjust my stitch length to be about 2.5. Alright, so we're going to do a straight stitch on this. I'm going to go ahead and lower my needle into the fabric and then do some back stitching. What is going on? I don't know, malfunction, but it's okay. We're back on track. I'm doing some straight stitching along that 5/8 inch seam allowance mark line along my throat plate. Alright, and I'm going to do some back stitching again. When I get to the end, raise up my needle and then trim off those thread tails at both the top and the bottom. Alright, then we gotta take a trip back over to the ironing board, and I'm going to bring my pinking shears with me this time. So go ahead, and I'm just going to reposition over here on the ironing board, and I'm going to bring my sample with me. And the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm just going to press this flat to make sure that all my no creases are in it. Then I'm going to go ahead and open that up and press that seam open. So I'm going to press it open by pressing down in an up and down manner. Then I'm going to go back, kind of wiggle it back and forth. Then go to the front side, make sure everything is in tip-top shape. Mine, I had a little bit of a crease going on there, so I'm glad that I repositioned and flipped that over. And since I did have that little error, I'm going to go back to the other side and just do one other final ironing on that to make sure that it's good to go. My, hopefully you guys won't run into this problem, but my iron's kind of spitting at me a little bit. Now what I'm going to do is I've gone ahead and pressed this open, and again we're going to be pressing the seam allowances to the side. And we're going to have that the upper seam allowance and the lower seam allowance again. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to trim that lower seam allowance with my pinking shears so that it's about 1/4 of an inch wide. So I'm just going to come back. I like using my pinking shears. I think that it's kind of a fast method of a way to complete an edge finish on any sort of fabric. You won't want to use a pinking for fabrics that really ravel. Some fabrics that really ravel are your synthetics, so your acetates, your polyesters, depending on the weave that they use. And then you also have a lot of raveling with silk. Silk's a natural fiber, but you still run into that problem. So when you have these fabrics that ravel a lot, which our cotton fabric doesn't, compared to other fabrics that you'll run into in the future, you're going to want to use a different type of edge finish. But I like to use my pinking shears whenever I can. Alright, now what I'm going to do is we're kind of creating that envelope again. And I'm going to press this around so that it catches on the bottom side. And then I'm going to flip it and then press it down. So again, what I'm doing is I'm going to envelope that pinked edge that I just did, the under edge, turn my top seam allowance over, and then flip everything on top so that my seam allowance is turned towards the back side. So I'm encasing that pinked edge that I just did. And I'm going to come back with my iron. I'm going to press that up and down, make sure everything is going to stay in place when I actually go and stitch it. Now it's really important for this step that you have consistency, because we're not going to be stitching from the back side like we've done before. We're going to be stitching from the front side. So make sure that you have at least a 1/4 inch distance between your stitched edge and that new folded envelope edge. Alright, when you get that done, then head back over to the sewing machine. Alright, so like I said before, we're actually going to be stitching from the top side of our fabric. Now this might be a little scary because we can't see that seam allowance that we just folded over. But what you can do, if it makes you feel better, just make sure that that seam allowance is folded over tight, and then come in with your pins and just pin that in place. There's nothing wrong with that. You know, it's better to take time now than having to like rip this out and redo it. So I'm just going to place some pins all the way around the edge here. And I'm just going to, you know, while I have you guys on the horn, I'm going to, you always, when you place your pins, you always want to make sure that the heads of your pins are going to be facing, I guess, your strong hand. And so I'm right-handed, and so the heads of my pins are always going to be facing on the right side, because then as I'm stitching, I can pull them out with my right hand and put them back in my pin box. Alright, so I placed some pins down just to hold that enveloped seam allowance casing that I created on the back side in place. And then what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be stitching about 1/4 inch to 3/8 inch away from the seam line. So I really, and then as you can see, when we do this method, we can't see any of our real guides. Any of our guides on our throat plate, because as the fabric's going over it, we can't see it. So what you're going to want to do, and if you want to do this, I would maybe you know, take a pencil or a washable marker. They have tailor's washable markers, or your tailoring pencil, and just every so often do a little line that shows where you are. Now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to use I'm actually going to do some adjustments on my sewing machine. If you go to your selector and turn it just to the left, it actually moves the placement of your needle. When it's in center position, and you go to the selector and you're going to just move it 1 notch to the left where it's doing a straight stitch, but what it's done is it's actually repositioned the placement of your needle so it's farther left. It's not on center anymore, it's to the left. Now what I can do is I can lower my presser foot, and I'm going to use this presser foot as a guide, and I'm going to run that just along my seam line edge, that first stitching that we had then pressed open. I can use that as a guide, and then my needle can easily catch that, you know, 3/8 to 1/4 inch marking, and catch all of my envelope that I can't see underneath. So I adjusted the placement of my needle, so it's off to the left, but I'm still going to keep my straight stitches about 2.5. Alright, so I'm using my presser foot as a guide right along my seam line. I'm going to go ahead and lower my needle in, and I'm going to do a couple back stitches. Alright, and as I approach those pins, I'm going to go ahead and stop and then pull them out. And what this does is, by using that seam line as a guide, you're going to have consistency of your straight stitches and of your top stitches from that seam line. And notice how I'm not going overly fast. We're not in a rush here. We really want to make sure that we're doing quality work all the time. And as I back stitch, there as I approach the end, I'm going to raise my presser foot up and pull out those threads, and then trim. Trim both the top tails and the bottom. Alright, and so this is your welt seam sample, and as you can see, when you go ahead and flip it over, that casing that you had created is like everything's folded in and tucked in just as it should be, and we have this nice row of decorative top stitching on the top side, on the fashion fabric side of the fabric. All right, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back over to the iron and do a final pressing and ironing on this, just so it looks great for my sample notebook, and call it a day. So make sure that you labeled all your sample pieces and you're placing them in the notebook to keep everything organized.